So it's a pleasure to have Indira Chaudhary here with us. Indira Chaudhary is the founder director of the Center for Public History at the Sri Sri Institute of Art, Design and Technology, Bangalore. Formerly professor of English at Jadavpur University, Kolkata, she is also the founder of Archival Resources for Contemporary History, Bangalore. A PhD in history from the School of Oriental and African Studies, London, her book, The Frail Hero and the Virile History, won the Tagore Prize in 2001. She was awarded the New India Fellowship to work on the manuscript of a recently published book titled Growing the Tree of Science, Homi Bhabha and the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. Interested in a number of fields, she has translated novels from Bengali to English, compiled the supplement of Indian English words in the Oxford Advanced Learners Dictionary, 1996, and also created archival books that bring archival material to the public. She researched and directed a book project on Asia's oldest museum entitled The Lives of Objects, Stories from the Indian Museum. Indira is a founding member of the Oral History Association of India. She was president of the Oral History Association of India and president of the International Oral History Association. So we look forward to listening to her today.
Thank you, Shipurna, for a very generous introduction. I'm really very grateful to RRI for having me here. In fact, this is work that I finished quite a while ago, but my engagement with scientific institutions continues. It began quite early, not through science as such, but because of my interest in the history of medicine. And when I returned to India after my PhD, I discovered that what we did not have were archives of contemporary institutions. And I felt that, one could start asking hospitals or medical colleges to put together their archives. That didn't really work. Nobody was interested. Till I broached this topic with Obed Siddiqui, and he said, well, this is very ambitious, but maybe you can do something related to us, to TIFR, and put together these papers. And it struck me when I started interviewing scientists that a lot of them who had done work over many, many years and had now retired, and I'm very happy to see you here because I've interviewed you too, I found them saying, we wondered, nobody ever asked us what we did. And which was a pity because they had worked in very, very difficult circumstances to do work which was appreciated internationally, but nobody knows about it, in India in a historical way. I mean, of course, scientists know about it. And I felt one of the reasons this was happening is that there were not too many archives that historians could consult. And the other reason that this was happening is somewhere in India we have started focusing only on the great figures of science or humanities and not looked at all the others who had done work. So I felt that doing oral history was a very interesting way of finding out how science was done in India. And so today I want to talk about something slightly contentious, and that is Bhabha's way of building a science institution. And I call it Science and the Creation of an Elsewhere. And we'll find out what he called the elsewhere, and Bhabha's international network and research at TIFR. Since we are in Riemann Research Institute, I thought I'd begin by showing you this one letter that Riemann wrote to Bhabha in 1950, November 1950, where he acknowledges Bhabha's letter and says, some collaboration that Bhabha wanted, and Riemann says, yes, we should do this, and he'll be happy to direct this work, but I don't think anything really comes of this research, because I think from what I heard from students of Raman I've talked to, is that he didn't really want government funds, because he felt the moment he took those funds, he had to spend more time writing the reports than doing his scientific work. And I feel increasingly, as I want to apply for funding, I feel like this is so much of a headache that when will the person do work? So I really often remember Raman for saying very vehemently that it's better to do my science than to run after funding. Bhabha was an admirer of Raman, had worked in IISc as a reader when Raman was there, before Raman left. That's Bhabha's sketch of Raman. And this is a note that we found when we were doing the Bhabha Archives, when he wrote about this great discovery, and he felt that this was a note that everyone has to remember what Raman did. And it was, again, he was doing science under very, very difficult circumstances. I wanted to, flag this, where he writes to Chandrasekhar in 1944. And this is very important to something that I have to say later, where he says, I have up to recently felt that after the war I would accept some good job in some university in Europe or America, because a place like Cambridge has an atmosphere which no place in India has at the moment. Now, this is not all of the letter. This is only part of it. It is true, he was during the war looking for a job. He wrote to Millikan, he wrote to people in Cambridge, but everyone said, we are so busy with the war effort that we cannot really, help you now. Bhabha was even willing to pay for his own passage and go and work there, because he said, I have nobody to talk science with in the Indian Institute of Science. They're just one or two people, and Raman is not so excellent, doesn't work in my area, so what should I do? And I think this letter, actually this is an introduction, then notice he says, I have up to recently. By the time he's writing this letter, he knows he will get support from the Tatas to start his own institute. So this letter is really to Chandrasekhar to ask him to return, to come and join the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, which he is about to begin. And I'll now show you some photographs from the beginnings. And though I call this picture the beginning, part of the beginnings, this is 19 December 1945, and this is in Bombay, in his aunt's house where TIFR starts. But TIFR really begins in the corridor of the main building in IISc. He doesn't move right away to Bombay. He moves 6 months later. And of course it takes him quite a long time, 9 years to get the land. This is the land in where TIFR is now. And there are not too many very young people, but those at the back, do you know who this man is? Any guesses? Who this man is? This is J.R.D. Tata, this is Nehru. I even know this person's name, Mr. Handa, who was Nehru's personal bodyguard. But anybody, any guesses? There's a famous science award in his name every year. That is Bhatnagar, yes. In fact, this is exactly to the date, a year before he dies. Bhatnagar dies on 1st January 1955. This is a picture taken 1st January 1954. And this is actually the inauguration, which happens 8 years later. It takes Bhabha a very long time to start this institute. And I'll just quickly play, because I think it's interesting to hear this voice, because this is a very different voice from the Tryst with Destiny speech that you hear of Nehru.
So I'm grateful to Dr. Bhabha for this opportunity given to me to come here great pleasure. So I'm grateful to Dr. Bhabha.
So I think when you look at this picture, there's Y.B. Chaman and Bhabha, and you can see a bit of J.I.D. Tata. And you find that this particular speech, he is, at this point, it's already 62. He's quite, it's not the same kind of voice that you are used to hearing when you listen to the Tryst with Destiny speech. This is again a very unique picture. I have a story around it, but I'll skip that for now. But the people you see here are, of course, this is Tata, Bhabha, that is Nehru, and this is Caseyth, K. Chandrasekharan, who actually starts, again I'm using the TIFR narrative, who doesn't begin the mathematics department, there's a story there too, but he's the one who actually builds it up. So I wanted to quickly recapitulate the historical context that we have before us, that you have already in 1938 the National Planning Committee that has people like Saha and J.C. Ghosh and others associated with it, who think that there has to be a plan for science in India. And in parallel, you also have, soon afterwards, you have the plan for Indian industry, the Bombay Plan of 1944. Same year, you have A.V. Hill visiting India, and he, in fact, recommends that one should really do something for science institutions. And it is the Hill report that actually makes us follow a very British model, as well as have a very centralized organization of research, if you look at the way the national labs are planned. And also Hill talks about how perhaps private philanthropy can be used for science. And this becomes a moot point in how Bhabha goes about building his institution. Because there is a certain shift in philanthropy, a conceptual shift, that what shall we do? Shall we only support people who are in distress, or shall we support talent? And Bhabha has a friend who again is associated with IISc. There's a hall named after him, Choksi, and it is Professor Rustam Choksi who supports Bhabha to the hilt. And his brother is the lawyer for the Tata Trust. And there's a letter in my book on Bhabha which sort of says, so-and-so, so-and-so, and so-and-so says yes. This person may not say yes, you need to emphasize this. So this is like, insider's view of how you should present this grant. And saying, you will get this grant, but, focus on these things, these are their worries, etc. But I think this shift is very important, because once they decide that they can fund large institutions that are headed by a single individual, there's a lot that becomes possible for Homi Bhabha. But of course, Bhabha was aware of one thing, and that was that science did not have its roots here. The reason he believed that is that there was no real, history of organized scientific research in India. That's not what the British wanted. If we look at the way the British go about establishing scientific institutions, it doesn't support even Ronald Ross. What they do instead is that they start doing surveys that enable them to exploit the mineral wealth, that enable them to take that wealth, enable them to do technologies that would create more profits. But scientific research is really not something that is supported. So this is probably why he thought that you have to really grow science like a tree so that its roots grow, and you have to really support. You can only accelerate it to some extent, but not too much. And you can't have too many mediocre workers. You have to support the outstanding ones. And that is his view at this point. I want to move now to Stephen Dedier, who is, in fact, he works on business intelligence and organizational behavior, and he's someone who is looking at science in underdeveloped countries. And this is what he says. And this is, I think, a fair description of what had happened to the university education in India. That you had universities that were quite literary and abstract in their orientation, and the civil services were modeled on the metropolitan services, that is, the services that are provided in England. So the bureaucracy has grown in a certain way, and the universities cater to that kind of education. So, you know, you enter and you do not have, really you stress humanistic, legal and administrative studies, and politics has no place for science. Even radical socialist politics, which spoke of planning and scientific socialism. This was approximately the cultural situation of science on the accession of independence, and it has not changed greatly since then. He's writing in 1963. I'm sorry about the text not being properly organized. Now, having said that, you find that this is again echoed to an extent by Bhabha, because he says the problem is that we have an administrative service, which is pretty good, but the administrative service is very backward because it does not know how to deal with science and technology. And we have inherited, he says, an extremely competent administrative service capable of dealing with all types of administration which had to be dealt with before independence in what was intended to be a static and underdeveloped economy. Consequently, experience of the type of administrator needed for industry and for science and technology has been lacking. The general absence of the proper administrative setup for science is a bigger obstacle to the rapid growth of science and technology than the paucity of scientists and technologists, because the majority of scientists and technologists we have are made less effective through the lack of the right type of administrative support. And this is something he keeps repeating, he keeps harping on this, saying, and in his own institute, he had wanted a very lean administration. He had said, if you have 13 scientists, you shouldn't have more than 6 administrators. Look at TIFR today, that is certainly not the case. You have 3 times the numbers, and you know, it's almost as if the clunkiness of the administrative machinery is something that bogs every institution down. And this is something that I think in India we have not given thought to. I mean, I remember a conversation when I was interviewing Kapila Vatsayana, and I told her, why didn't you change it? Because, you know, you entered the civil service. And she kept quiet for a very long time, and I thought I'd asked her a wrong question. And she said, you know, I think you're probably right. We should have changed it. There's no need for this rule of triplicate and all of this. We could have made it efficient, but we just carried on with the British system.
So is the implication that...
Can I take questions later?
Okay, sure.
Yeah. So I think this is another historical note he writes in 54, where he says that, you know, when you want to make an institute of fundamental research, you have to have an unrestricted exchange of ideas. So an institute for fundamental research has to be open to all scientists of eminence, whatever the country to which they belong, and should be unfettered by the secrecy regulations required in commercial and strategic establishments. Now, why is he saying this? Firstly, by then, he already has the atomic energy. You know, he's already in charge of atomic energy, but he wants a different identity for TIFR. He also wants it to be free he wants scientific, he wants scientists from across the world to apply and come into TIFR. And that's what he does. So So one of the things that I always say, though this man, S.S. Chur, the mathematician who was in Princeton, does not come to TIFR. But this I was very charmed by when I found this letter where Bhabha's inviting him to come and spend time in TIFR because there's civil war in China. And it's a very moving letter, given the date. It's 1949, India's independent, and here is, and it's still sort of, an economy that's not flourishing, of course. So, but he still feels that you should reach out to neighboring countries and tell them that, look, you can come and work here till things are all right. But by then, Chur is already in Princeton. He hasn't got this letter. He gets it only in Princeton. The other person who actually, in fact, comes and spends almost 8-9 years in India in different stages, stays for a long time, is Bernard Peters. And he sets up the experimental physics group in TIFR. Bernard Peters, the problem that happens with him is that he is seen as, Oppenheimer actually gives an interview where he says he's a dangerous man and quite red. And this actually leads to his passport being seized, and he's not allowed to really travel. And Bhabha then decides that he has to get Peters here to India and let him work here, and that happens after a while. Meanwhile, what we found in the TIFR archives is that you had the Times of India writing this about Peter, Tata Institute expert, I read Dr. Oppenheimer alleges. So this is 19th April 1954. And of course, there is a letter to Bhabha from J.R.D. Tata saying, will you please explain what he's doing here? How long is his contract? What is he doing, etc. And Bhabha writes a long defense of Bernard Peters. And later when I talked to Peters, in fact I was in touch with his wife and his 2 children I'm in touch with, they said, this is absolutely correct. Our father was never a member of the Communist Party, but was obviously anti-Nazi. He actually escapes from one of the death camps and makes his way to America, where he is first a longshoreman who's just carrying luggage, and then he meets Oppenheimer, starts attending classes, and he becomes a physicist through working with Oppenheimer. And Bhabha then very clearly says he was questioned by the Committee of Un-American Activities and deposed on oath that he had never been a member of the Communist Party and did not, as so many others have done, refuse to testify on grounds that he might incriminate himself, thereby showing himself to be a man of principle and character. He is distinguished for his work on cosmic rays, and he's made valuable contributions on the subject. So he makes it clear that he's not about to budge and say that Peters should go back, because Peters doesn't go back to America, he goes back to Denmark. He goes to Denmark, where he begins to head the space program. But after spending almost 9 years here, the children are educated here. So this, I felt, was actually a different kind of scientific internationalism, where you feel that if someone is really being victimized in their country, if there is some way you can bring that person into your institution gains, your country gains. In fact, one of the things historians notice, and I'm sure this is known all over, is that is what happened to the United States. It got, the World War II creates, this huge, migration, and within that are also scientists who come and enrich the scientific life of the US. So I think what he's trying to do in his institution is to create networks that would expose the students to what is going on in physics. This is an interesting 1950 conference on elementary particles. The last one of a certain kind of physics. Soon afterwards, physics is going to change. But you see practically everybody here. You see Saha, of course, here. That is Bibha Chaudhary. Yashpal here. Bhabha, of course, you see. But you see Blackett, Patrick Blackett. I mean, in fact, I think I have something which identifies all of them. This is still when TIFR is in Old Yacht Club. So where you have that energy offices now. You can never get a picture like this anymore. But I think this is one of the things he starts doing. That, can you invite scientists from all over the world to spend time in your institution, where either they come for conferences and some of them come to give lectures before the conference, so students are sort of, get familiar with what kind of science they'll be listening to afterwards. Another unique way in which they devise at this point is every scientist is assigned one student who will do lecture notes. And the lecture notes become a way of learning that science. So I remember Professor Gauker saying, Pauli was such a difficult speaker. The science you could follow, but he would mumble, and I had to take his notes, and then I had to go and sit with him and work it out. And then these notes were circulated to whichever science institution wanted them. So if you think of the time, 50s, 60s, I think it's a unique way to bring up a generation of scientists who then get very familiar with new work. So I thought this would be interesting. Bhabha's doodles of, that's Dirac, Pauli. So you have a whole lot of them, Richardson. So, this is something he's doodling at the Solvay conference much earlier. But I wanted to say that, when we historians look at science, we don't only look at, what is the science being done. If he's saying that he has to create an atmosphere that is missing in India, missing in the universities, what is he trying to do? This is a sketch by Helmut Barsch, who's the architect of TIFR buildings. And what Bhabha does is he gets the Chicago architect who had done buildings in Brazil and other parts to create this building which looks very unique. And to most historians of architecture and historians of art, this kind of building that TIFR is now, this kind of building is very, very modern. It's associated with a certain kind of architectural modernity. And I think the reason he does that is that he wanted two things. One, the building should look very different, actually, because it's housing a very different culture. So he wants to mark that. But he also says that, scientists will work and live, spend a lot of time. So it has to be a building that allows for, in fact, he talks about this as a place where scientists can walk about and refresh their minds. And I think, so he says that this has been designed as a machine because it's something that you live and work in, so you're also part of that machinery. And that's one of Corbusier's goals. But the other interesting thing, the other reason I think he does this is not only to make his institute look, a certain way, but also it will house that culture, that very elusive culture he wants to create. And so he does other things. So what he says, there's a larger design for living, and if you look at the kind of things that he does within the institute, so, these are chairs that are created, these are very Bauhausian designs. Bauhaus is the epitome of modern architecture that brings craft, science and technology together in Germany just before the Nazis destroy their school, and then they disperse all over. But you find that this is not something he can afford to bring into TIFR. So what does he do? He brings the catalogs, and it is the carpenters who create these chairs and furniture that looks a certain way. He also is a person who pays attention to a lot of details. These are the sketches for the kind of gardens. You look at the, an attempt to create the atomic structure in one of the gardens in BRC. And of course his famous amoeba garden, which you'll still see in TIFR, in the West Lawn. That actually, there are many amusing stories about how he creates it, looking at it from his 4th floor office. And he starts collecting art. And this is very, very interesting, because at this moment, this is the first Hussein he buys in '54, and this is the first Krishan Khanna. And Krishan Khanna told me that he was surprised that this was bought, because it was Hussein who sold this painting to Bhabha, saying, I have this other friend who's also part of the Bombay Progressives. So that is the interesting thing, that this institution is in Bombay. Bombay is a very, very cosmopolitan city. During World War II, there are lots of refugees from Europe, Jewish dancers, musicians, artists who come to Bombay. And it is through interaction with them, even though they don't acknowledge it, the Bombay Progressives start to paint in a certain way. And they're not telling you about this, but they know, they are very inspired by some of the Vienna masters who are in Bombay at that time. And of course, Bhabha is also part of the scene, as is Mulk Raj Anand, who runs Marg. And there's a very interesting correspondence with Mulk Raj Anand. And when Bhabha dies, Mulk Raj Anand writes that, I always felt that you try to make your scientists, the younger scientists, citizens of the world. So you introduced them to art. You brought them here, so that they could actually, if they went anywhere else, they would know what the finer things of life are about. Now, it also had its disadvantages, because sometimes, just reading the archives, one gets the idea that this creation of this atmosphere was, it went to ridiculous extents. So here is a letter, an exchange between Casey, the mathematician, and Bhabha. And this is about a tradition, about whether the tea that will be served after a colloquium, and I hope will be served tea that we won't have to pay for, that, Bhabha says, in Cambridge people pay for the tea, they put something, we should have the same practice. And of course, very sarcastically, Chandrasekhar writes, Rutherford has been dead for many years, and the description of the Cambridge tradition given by the director is rather incomplete, since even food is free for fellows at Cambridge. We are not a university, and the comparison with Cambridge does not seem quite right. The Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton, from where he came, and civil institutes have tea served in their common room every day of the week free of charge. This has helped to build an atmosphere which even Dirac would, I'm sure, recognize. If this is impossible to secure in a building our size, I would give it all up. So, this goes to this kind of ridiculous extent, that what Cambridge traditions will you bring into your institute? Bhabha's, of course, since he's educated in Cambridge, he's also trying to almost find what is familiar to him. Now, I want to now move to another sociologist who we look at quite often, who's looked at Asian intellectuals and what happens to the Asian intellectuals. And he says, generally one finds that there is a sense of disbelief in some of the traditional beliefs, but they do have a larger understanding of man's place on earth. But they're more secular in their understanding of the world, more hedonistic in their conception of a good life, more egalitarian in principle, more accepting of science, technology, progress, and the potentialities of human initiative in changing society. This is quite a large study he does, mainly, I mean, he looks at India, but he also looks at other Asian countries in the 70s. But of course, India is a very major part of the study, so he's obviously very impressed with the people he meets. Now, when we look at this, and then we try to look at how histories of science institutions are constructed, we find sometimes they're hidden or forgotten histories, not quite the generous intellectuals that Schills talks about. So if I look at the 25-year report of TIFR, this is what it says, that it's K. Chandrasekharan who joined the institution in 1949, that he starts organizing a full-fledged school of mathematics and promoting mathematical research at the highest level, etc. This is true. It is not a false statement. But what is hidden from view or forgotten is that mathematics existed in TIFR from 1945. The two people who were employed very early is a very bad picture of F.W. Levy and D.V. Kosambi. And this is, I was quite shocked when I found the statement, and I said, why is it? What is it? And throughout my time in TIFR, I spent a lot of time trying to see what is it that prevents TIFR from acknowledging for a very long time. Right now, TIFR institutions have the Kosambi Memorial Lecture. There's a place for Kosambi, but there was no place for Kosambi at one point, and he had worked from 45 to 62. So what happened? And he's a polymath. He's a scholar who is a historian as well as a statistician, but he's also very eccentric, which is what costs him this reputation. So I think Levy, of course, leaves by 1950 and has not had that much of an influence over people. Very few remembered him. But what had happened is that from 49 onwards, that is 4 years after Kosambi was appointed, you had K. Chandrasekharan really building the school of mathematics. And I have here one example, one photograph, which I often like to call the math tea party or the mad tea party. So this is a beautiful picture at Old York Club, and you find that these are mathematicians who had come for the International Colloquium on Function Theory in 1960. From 49 onwards is a period that I call the professionalization of mathematics in TIFR. They really are, he's sending the young mathematicians to Paris. They're actually meeting the Bourbaki. They are doing mathematics at the highest level. And you find that that is not something that Kosambi is doing. Kosambi is still doing his statistical analysis. He's not part of this new, integration of research and mathematics in the new school. He's really not part of that. And that actually creates all kinds of other problems. So around this time, a little after this, Kosambi makes a claim that he has solved the Riemann hypothesis. And this is a letter written by not just Chandrasekharan, but a number of others, including the younger people. At that point, Professor Narasimhan and Sheshadri were both young, and they write to, they sign this letter, where he talks about the Riemann hypothesis that Kosambi has solved. And he says, because of the international network, it is becoming very difficult for us to face our colleagues who are laughing at us, you know. So we feel you should make an inquiry, it should be assessed. And why is it that if we are in this institute, we don't know that he solved this? Because this is a huge thing, right? If you've solved the Riemann hypothesis, we should know. And so once they write this, Bhabha of course sets up a committee, and I think it's Carl Siegel and someone else, I have the name in my book, who actually go through it and very seriously write a report saying, no, this is not any solution to the Riemann hypothesis. And so, of course, this is, you know, scientific dishonesty, how do you deal with it? And of course, he's also saying deal with it quietly and effectively. Kosambi's contract was not a long-term contract. He had been getting these one-year contracts for a while. I've tried to find out why, but I think by then Bhabha was also convinced that this other group was doing greater work. Kosambi was doing a lot of historical work at that point. And his contract is not renewed. He's not thrown out, as some people told me when I went there. He's not, he's asked to explain, and he says they don't understand my mathematics, but his contract is not renewed. And he's about to retire in another year or so. So that's that, and that's why I feel that this is the reason that the School of Mathematics found it very awkward to even mention in its history that it had D.D. Kosambi as part of its, you know, not as School of Mathematics, but as one of the first mathematicians who was there in at TIFR. If we move on a bit, I think I want to talk about a little bit about what happens to this network. I think Bhabha relies a lot on this international network to, you know, send people to him, who write to him. For example, Obaid Siddiqui writes to him, and the two letters, you know, he gets up from people who, of course, Leo Szilard writes to Bhabha first, saying that, you know, here's this young man, and I'm sending two letters from people he's done postdoctoral work with, and, you know, you might want to consider him. And, of course, that immediately lets, you know, gets Bhabha moves very fast on these things. So he writes back, and that's the story of how Obaid Siddiqui comes to TIFR. But what is interesting there is that it is again that Cambridge network. Szilard is someone Bhabha had knew in Cambridge. And this larger network through Princeton and Cambridge is what brings Govind Swarup, who makes the Ooty telescope, and I have one picture there, oops, which actually is something that, you know, it's not just Bhabha getting this letter. This is interesting because the group that come together, T.K. Menon, Mukul Kundu and Govind Swarup, and there was Krishnan, they come together and they are trying to see who can they write to, where can they get a space, and they write to several places, and most government places don't move so fast. And you know, it is Bhabha who moves very fast, and these are the people who write for them. Bart Bok, J. Porcy, and a number of them write to Bhabha, and Bhabha, of course, knows them through his network. And he's immediately very conscious that, you know, he must get them here. And it is interesting that that story itself is quite complicated, because T.K. Menon never does come back, even though he writes those letters initially. I'm quite lucky to have talked to all of them and interviewed all of them. And I think it's a very interesting moment of seeing how these networks actually place young Indian scientists in an institution that wants them, that will actually support them, because Bhabha has the financial means to support these new things. And when they write to the university or even to the national laboratories, they don't get through. Those are very bureaucratized spaces. I think, if these spaces were not bureaucratized, it would be quite different. So this is what happens, but you notice that there is a certain way in which these scientists look at India. This international network looks at India in a certain way where if we have a role in growing some part of science there, we would feel very, very happy about it. And that's an image, I think, that has, of late, you don't see that same kind of course, we are much more equal within those circles, but you don't have that sense of building a country as you have in the 60s. Now, I'll end with one thing that I want to talk about, that this worked very well, this way of training young scientists, of sending scientists abroad and letting them do their PhDs there, and then they come back to TIFR. But TIFR remained very isolated for a very long time. This wonderful international network ignored another thing that ought to have made it flourish as a science, and that is the national networks. They hardly had any sort of interaction with the kind of science that was going on in India. So they would be, really very, very, this was really an ivory laboratory that I call. And when one of the persons I interviewed was Professor Mukunda, who leaves TIFR to come to IISc. And he says the difference was, in IISc I met my peers. I met people who were doing science in India, and you could, interact with them. And he felt happier being here. So I'll end with Professor Mukunda. So he felt that, to be cut off from the rest of the country when you're doing science was not such a good thing. So I think when I talked about science being, created elsewhere, creating this elsewhere of science, it was like Bhabha had a very interesting idea that, can we create that atmosphere where people will talk about their research, where they'll do this. And he even oversteps, he really tries to make a Cambridge model and doesn't succeed so much, but he tries. You see all those ingredients. But I think one of the parts that's left out is this interaction. I mean, he talks about how scientists should actually do their research and go and teach in universities. TIFR scientists, some of them, yes, but not all of them. Because, you are building another network, and that itself takes a lot of energy to, keep going, to keep it going. That this is not something that he pays much attention to. And though he talks about how the universities can really gain from these research institutions, the lack of, really creating mechanisms whereby, the university system can flourish, because he began with the idea that the British didn't support research in universities. Even he, with his power, is not able to do that. And I think that happens because of this conceptualization of science as something that requires a special atmosphere, which we can imitate from somewhere else and create. And we can put our own ingredients in it. But we leave out one thing, which was so important, and which was recognizing that there's work done, in other places, in India, and making that very, very strong. So I want to end with that. Thank you very much. I can take questions now.
The question was related to this point you raised again. This point you raised again, which is very the question was related to the point that you raised again, which is very curious because which is very interesting because we imagine countries where establishing even that little amount of science was very hard. So it sort of seems like somehow, because, and I don't want to say it in this way, but somehow or the other, that they had set up the groundwork in some ways through the university systems for certain kind of research to ultimately happen. And IISc was one example, and so on. But of course, that was funded also by the Tatas and so on. But there was a very interesting perspective. So, and you are saying that those were set up to, of course, for the colonial enterprise. But was this but you don't think of this as producing science as a fallout of it, or and was science a fallout of it, or was it actually that there were no properly established systems in place for the growth of science?
No, they see, the British were the systems were very well established. But if you look at what is creativity in science, what kind of papers, so you'll have the exceptional people. You'll have Riemann doing his work, right? But if you look at what comes out of the university, there are very few papers that are coming out at that point. And even when that's why I give the example of Ronald Ross. He's not given any money to continue his work. He does it, he takes his slides, he goes and does it in the UK. So they did what they needed. So, if you look at geology departments, they are mainly working with surveys and working with, what can be mined. So most of these, and there has been work on Science and the Raj, where they are, Deepak Kumar looks at very carefully at what is it that's going on. So you see a huge difference between, scientists who are struggling and making themselves, and they have more opportunities really after independence, where, they are supported. There's some support. It's not a lot. But, you begin to see that because you'd have people like S.N. Bose, for example, if you read the kind of time lag between when he's writing and when the letter is reaching, it's a huge, huge difference. It's like very hard to do science in the periphery. I mean, even Australia says the same story is there. That they find that, they might have, if there was better communication or if they were at the center, they would have done more. It's just that there's not that kind of support. And that too, we are talking about few exceptional individuals. But in general, and even the scientists who I have spoken to who studied in pre-independent India, they used to be, like if you studied chemistry, for example, you would get a job that was ensured. So if you wanted to do physics, you're not so sure that you'll get a job. So there are all kinds of ways in which people indicate that what was going to be viable. I mean, I'm sure there are elders here who will be able to tell us what it was like, because it is, I think, post-independence that there's a great deal of support, particularly Nehru. So Shields and even Dedier, when they talk about the underdeveloped country and underdeveloped science, they are often talking about Nehru, because Nehru is all over the world, someone who's a supporter of science. And I think he was one fellow of the Indian Academy of Sciences who's not a scientist. Deservedly, I mean, he was seen as someone who supported science, understood some of it, but, he wouldn't make outrageous statements. So.
This is just a comment. In scientific institutions, it's very, I don't know how to think about it, but it seems to me they cannot be divorced from the social milieu. For example, my friends who came from Europe and stayed in TIFR have commented that it is an inverted prison. And there is also a conflict, from what I understand, between Bhabha and Mahalanobis. So I don't know how to think about these matters, but maybe you can comment.
Well, Bhabha and Mahalanobis, that is a very interesting conflict, because Mahalanobis, we have his plans for the early planning, he's head of planning commission, but both are very close to Nehru. And of course, there are certain kinds of funding that actually, this comes out very transparently in Kosambi, who's not scared of anything. Kosambi's letters to Bhabha, saying, do you really want to ask for this, for the journal? Because you know that Maulana Bis will not want you to get this. He's very frank. But I think if we look at, this concept of the inverted prism, I think you've put it well, because I think when I talked about the elsewhere that he was creating, it had all those ingredients, but it was in a way outside. It was not quite Bombay. It was making use of the cosmopolitanism of Bombay.
One more comment I just wanted to...
Can I say something?
Yeah.
At that time, just outside of the TIFR, there was a big slum. Okay, so you encounter it every time you go out. So the statement was very apt. You could see what the outside world was.
Absolutely. And in fact, I think some of them have also talked to me about the 70s. When they said, this institute ensured that we had, we had a decent living, but you couldn't ignore what you saw outside. And 60s, 70s was very, very tough to see what was happening outside. The mills were shutting down. There was a lot of poverty around. And somehow that discussion, the one discussion I see is description of riots that again Kosambi sends Bhabha, saying this is what happened when we tried to buy some things. See, early equipment building, that's another interesting part, is out of war surplus material that is available in Chur Bazaar. And riots are happening there. And Kosambi is describing all this to Bhabha, saying, oh yeah, this happened. But, it doesn't, the way they go about building it, it's almost cocooned off. It's sort of a very secure place outside of, all that you see in Bombay.
But I just wanted to comment. There's this other model, which is the Bengal model, if I could say. J.C. Bose, S.N. Bose, they were very deeply committed to science popularization in the native language. I think that also could have had a positive role in spreading awareness outside this insular environment.
Yes, and I think when I haven't interviewed at any length, I've just talked to him, Anil Sadgopal, but Anil Sadgopal leaves and goes off to Hoshiarabad. So you'll see that some of them just feel, that they have to go and do something else. But again, some of them are quite happy with this, because, again, I feel there is the world of that popularization of science and the world of this very abstract, fundamental science.
Well, this is a case where there is an intersection between.
Yes, there was, definitely.
Yeah. Can I add one more to that? I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
No, on the same thing. If you look at ISI Calcutta, they had people like Mogorov come to Calcutta and give lectures. At the same time, they had a lot of contact with other Indians. Yeah? And they were doing first aid work and while still being part of the milieu.
Same with the Saha Institute.
Yes.
Same with the Saha Institute. Though slightly different trajectory, but you find that they don't remain isolated from the world.
Yeah, I just want to comment on the Saha's model, which is more organic, I think.
Yes.
He wanted institutes to grow out of universities, which is in contrast with Bhabha's idea.
Yeah.
I had another comment on another reason for the silence around Kosambi could have been his open criticism of the atomic power.
Yes, in fact, for reason of time, I took out the slide. There was a very interesting thing he had proposed in, I think, the Rotary Club in the 60s in Pune. He had said that, we can harness solar energy. Instead of being so imitative and going after nuclear energy, why do we have to do that? And, one thing is often said that this is probably what Bhabha didn't like. But I can't actually see it in any papers. The problem is that Kosambi was gone. His daughter was around still, but she didn't know many of these nitty-gritty. The person who would have known, I had known him for a while, was Mr. Nene, who had worked very closely with Kosambi in Pune, because I studied in Pune for a while and worked with him in the anti-nuclear thing. We used to go to schools and talk to them. But, so I didn't get, I mean, I knew that this must have had an effect. But it's not discussed in the correspondence, or nobody mentions that Bhabha took note of it. He must have taken note of it. But Kosambi himself, in a later essay, regrets this claim that he made about the Riemann hypothesis. He says, you know, that was not needed. I didn't need to make that claim. The other thing that was happening was he was doing some statistical work on births and deaths with statistics from Bombay hospitals. That also Bhabha points out that, you know, when you came here, you talked about something fundamental like statistical theory and how it can be taken forward. But it's just applying statistical, you know, analyzing statistical data in this mechanical way for which, you know, we are giving you space and time is not really what the, you know, this institution was built for. So there is somewhere sort of disillusionment with what he's expecting from Kosambi, and also because it's a moment that the school has become professional and doing a different kind of work. And there's a very sarcastic letter where he says that you are a mathematician, I want to be able to say what work you're doing, so tell me that. After all, you have given me this beautiful photograph of, Kosambi was a very good photographer, he was many things. So after all, the photograph that hangs in my office, I cannot show somebody that and say that that is your work. So there is a lot of that kind of back and forth. But in the beginning, they are very good friends. And you know, whatever Kosambi is translating from Sanskrit, Bhabha, he's telling Bhabha and telling Bhabha that, you know, Oppenheimer pretends to know Sanskrit, just tell him I've done this. So there is that kind of friendliness. And it sort of changes. From what I hear from people like Yashpal or Professor Srikantan, who were there when Kosambi was there, Kosambi never spent any time at the institute. He would come every day by Deccan Queen and leave by Deccan Queen. And that was, everyone knew him as this historian, you know, someone, the scholar who wrote on the train. And including Romila Thapar, who says she traveled once from Bombay to Pune with him. And she said, I was so young, I don't know what my brother was thinking, that I can, you know, just sit and gain something by talking to him. I was just too young to too much in awe of him. So maybe that was another reason. His link with institutional life was really not that strong. It remained very individual and, you know, and then it faded out. But I think there was no, I mean, what I feel a little upset about is that he was a polymath. And there was no way in which, could there not have been a way in which they acknowledged the work he did instead of, you know, just holding on to this thing. In fact, I think in an informal conversation, one of the mathematicians who was younger at that point said, I have often thought about that and wondered if we could have been more generous and not written that way to her. But I suppose it was also the moment when they were just beginning to be recognized and they didn't want any blight on that recognition. I think, you know, it's a complicated thing. But thank you for pointing out the nuclear and solar energy.
See, I want to make a comment. I think the whole discussion questions are scratching very superficial issues. I think what Bal mentioned is that science cannot be divorced from the society in which it's practiced. And if you, I think, read Abdul Salam Nobel lecture, I think, if I remember right, that's where he mentions that if you look at human history, the richest countries were those where physics was a frontier. So the countries, which had good physicists was always a rich and powerful country. I think it's Salam's Nobel lecture. Reviews of modern physics will find. So you see, I was a student in US doing a PhD. At that time we were very arrogant. We were disdainful. Galbraith had this book, Military Industrial Complex and all that. We thought ourselves to be above all that. But actually now looking back, I have some unpublished reports by people like Whiteman and Nambo, which clearly shows that US is in forefront of, at least in physics, because of their technological base. And I think until you have something like that, you cannot hope to have a very good science.
True. And that is why in India, when you have the colonial period, you do not have technology growing.
No, but you see, they brought in technology
which is used for a certain purpose.
For colonial domination.
Yeah, there is no teaching of it.
But Indira, you notice that after independence, the support went up manifold. And Riemann used to deride it as Nehru-Bhatnagar effect.
Yes.
But the quality of science did not improve.
That's a very apt comment.
This is just a remembrance. In 1961, in the Indian Institute of Science, there was a winter school, which was one of the first that they were organized. And I was there, and Bhabha was there, and also Gelman.
It was Gelman and Dalits.
And Dalits was there. And I remember having tea with all this, coffee or tea, whatever, all with all these people. And there arose the discussion of the nuclear bomb. And I recall that Bhabha was strongly supporting it, while Gelman was criticizing it vehemently. So I do remember this problem.
Though there is a letter to Blackett in the archives where he is against the bomb. So it's difficult. By then, of course, 61, he's already got atomic energy. He wants to, have the. But it's interesting because that is again something I've written about, that winter school, summer school it was, summer institute. But someone like Rajaji, he talks about how people like Bhabha or M.G.K. Menon did not ask the right questions. Little push to Gelman and Dalits, and they would have, come up with the theory that they come up with later, because they had presented their work in its raw form. So he calls it a missed opportunity. He felt that school, he said we were quite young, but the seniors also seemed to have not got, the kind of way, the kind of direction in which physics had moved.
Gelman at that conference presented his eightfold way.
Yes.
Which later became the standard QCD model.
Absolutely.
This I do remember, taking notes and so on.
Yes.
One more thing is puzzling is about this Bernard Peters. Oppenheimer himself was pretty red, so accusing Peters as being...
Well, but Oppenheimer is known to have accused many of his students, at least 3 of his students, who then go off to different parts. They cannot function in the US. One goes to Brazil, one functions in parts of Egypt, and Peters comes here. So it's interesting that I think Oppenheimer is he's read, as is his brother Frank Oppenheimer, but I think when he's taken in, he reveals.
That's his best defense offense.
That's his best defense. That's right.
The person in Syracuse who was, who also was
Joe Weinberg. Joe Weinberg.
Joe Weinberg
Yeah.
at Syracuse was also somebody who was ratcheted out by
Yeah.
by Oppenheimer.
And also,
He was accused as being the person who passed the secrets to
Yes.
the Soviets.
That's right.
And he lost his job for several years.
Yeah, that happened a lot.
if there are no more questions, let's thank Indira for a very insightful talk.